So today, let's talk about two important things. We're going to talk about the spy balloons, the flying objects, and also the pipeline demolition operation. All of the big channels are feeding you a line of Bravo Sierra. And a lot of their conclusions and the information they're sharing with you, it shows how little they actually know about the real world, military planning, and how things actually work. And if this is the case, it teaches you that their survival planning information and the basis for making decisions are crap. So let's first start with the pipeline. Now, the pipeline that was demolished, we all know that that was actually a military operation. The question is, who did it? And what a lot of people don't understand is there's a lot of special operations that are not in SOCOM. They're buried in other agencies. They're also buried in corporate. So a lot of special operators, they can be considered, instead of mercenaries, they can be considered a techno merc. Now, a techno merc can be a subject matter expert. It can be somebody that builds something, somebody that fixes something, somebody that destroys something, or special skills. Now, one of the nuclear dumps I worked on, 3 of the people were lent to us from Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Those 3 people were involved in dismantling the nuclear artillery rounds that were brought back to the United States from Europe during the nuclear warhead reduction activities that were associated with the various treaties. These people, there's not many of them, and they are shared by corporations in the federal government under the federal government's tutelage. Now, another instance of this that has to do with the pipeline is the fact that there are specialty divers. I did a lot of diving operations. I ran them. I'm not a diver, but we always used the U.S. Navy diving manual. So everybody in the business is familiar with that. And what that does is goes through the various gases and depths and different ways to dive. For instance, the divers I used at nuclear sites, power company sites, and other industrial sites, they were specialty divers. So they did underwater construction, they did observations, we had underwater vehicles we used to look at things and collect data, and they were always on a first call contract with the federal government. So for instance, I was working on one nuclear dump where we were digging things up and disposing of them at a different location. And the dive crew I had there, in one instance, a CH-53 came on the job site, picked them up, and took them to Miami. And what the federal government wanted them to do in Miami was, there was a Israeli flag cruise ship. And the FBI had got a notice that there was limpet mines were going to be placed on this ship, and politically, different countries wanted to sink that ship in the United States. So they pulled the dive team I had off of my job site at the nuclear dump, flew them down to Miami to inspect the bottom of that ship. They dived under it, looked up and down it, checked the keel, and didn't find anything. Another instance, they flew another CH-53 into the job site, picked my dive crew up, took them up to Norfolk. In that instance, they had a freighter that came from China that the Chinese were trying to smuggle something in. So the ship was loaded with cement powder, and the chemical assays did not come up properly for this material. So they knew the Chinese were smuggling something into the United States in this concrete powder. They'd mixed it in there. So they took my dive team, and the hole on that ship was 90 feet deep. So they threw plywood down on the concrete powder, and they used sampling tubes to sample all up and down that 90 feet of concrete powder. And then they gave that material and samples to federal government employees who checked to see what was contained in this concrete powder that wasn't supposed to be there. Now, when you do this kind of work, a lot of times the reports, the information, the samples, they all become classified. And you're never told what was in them, or sometimes you're not ever told what they're looking for. But that's kind of a Techno Merc operation. So you can see it's actually very easy if you were in the federal government and you wanted limited knowledge of an operation and plausible deniability. You could go to 2 or 3 of these contractors, put you a Techno Merc crew together, fly them on a third-party vehicle somewhere else in the world, do an op, come back, and nobody would know the difference. So that's how things happen without other people's knowledge. Now, when we look at balloons, aerial vehicles, and what they call objects, all of the big countries do surveillance ops. Now, a civilian or corporate balloon or research balloon or craft would have a transponder in it or radio gear sending data. That way it's locatable to air traffic. So if it was necessary to have a research balloon or a surveillance balloon in an area that the government knew of, collecting data, it would have a pinger on it so aircraft could see where it was at, and they'd give a NOTAM for the location. Now, the federal government uses balloons in the United States to spy on its own people and collect data. Some of those don't have a pinger that aircraft could find, but it has a pinger that the federal government can find. Now, there are several reasons you would use a balloon rather than satellite data. When I was in school the first time in the 80s, the department that I was studying under used to make maps for the federal government and also for the CIA. The head of that GIS unit used to make maps for the Central Intelligence Agency. And as such, they had all kinds of data that they could pull from census. We used to look at RB57 aerial photographs. We used to look at Landsat images. So when we look at these reconnaissance balloons and so forth, they provide a special kind of low altitude and very clear image data, as well as signals data that you can't pick up via satellite. And the fact is, I looked at satellite imagery, aerial photographs, SLAR, which is side-looking airborne radar off of F4s, and also FLIR. So we also looked at different kinds of infrared and ultraviolet and other types of electromagnetic spectrum. And you could use that to see all kinds of things from plant health to the content in the air of different gases, etc. So what I'm getting to here is using balloons at lower altitudes, you can collect specific information, and that information is used to guide cruise missiles, to guide drones, and to do stealth drone operations, stealth drone supply ops, things like that. And the way it works is, if you're subject to jamming, GPS, electronic countermeasures, your cruise missiles and your drones have to have a self-contained navigational array. And there's 2 ways to do this. One is celestial navigation, which means you have to see the night sky or be in space. That's how ICBMs work. A lot of cruise missiles, the old way they used to do it is they would take a U-2 or an SR-71, they would overfly the path to the target and make a film strip of this. and they would use an optical comparator, and they would compare the image on the film strip to the image in the recon lens on the cruise missile or the drone to the path it's supposed to be flying on. And based on the optical principles of the film strip versus what it was seeing, it would correct the course. And in that manner, you need no outside communication with the device to get it to the target. So one of the reasons you would want to do balloon reconnaissance and stealth drone reconnaissance is to gather that data so that you have direct paths that are not dependent on GPS or telemetry to guide your weapons. The other one is the fact that you can loiter over a target area and watch it for a period of time. Now, the other thing to talk about is stealth drones. So if you have a stealth drone, it would operate kind of like an F-117. You would fly it at night. The top of it would be camouflage based on terrain. The bottom of it would be flat black. And what you could do is fly into the United States through Alaska or Canada. During the day, you could land that drone. There's plenty of abandoned fields and properties and parks and wilderness areas. And then you would operate the drone at night. You could actually hopscotch that thing anywhere you wanted in the United States. Now, the biggest thing about that is the fact that the powers that be have demonstrated to the people in the United States that they are accessible and there is no coherent defense of the homeland. So the last thing to think about is if you look at the areas these craft were operating in, they were over military bases. In Alaska and Canada, they were at radar sites where you have over-the-terrain radar, high-level radar, and so forth. So these are some of the things you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about these crafts, these objects. And going back to the video I made before the war in Ukraine started, I set out and specifically told you that there would be penetration operations and spec ops events going on in Alaska, Canada, and the west coast of the United States. And now you're seeing that. So if you want more details on these ideas, go check those old videos out. So please share your thoughts. We'll see you on the next video.